Hi. So in the last module, there were two terms that we used rather extensively without really defining them formally or rigorously. So before we go forward, it will be nice to have a slightly better idea of what those two terms refer to. And these two terms are species and evolution. Now, turns out that in evolutionary biology, the term species has not one or two, but many definitions. Why is that so? That is because different people have defined species concepts based on the specific use case to which they have used this concept. So, because of that, although the concepts by themselves are consistent, when you take one concept or what is species according to one concept and try to examine it in the light of another concept, you get into all kinds of troubles. Which is why there are multiple books, of which I am just showing you 4, there are more, and thousands of papers where people have tried to examine these various species concepts and how they relate to each other. So, since we are doing a very introductory course over here, we are not going to get into all these philosophical and other methodological issues. We are going to talk about two specific kinds of species concepts, the so called morphospecies concept and the biological species concept. So, what are these? So, if you look at the way Carolus Linnaeus or Darwin thought about species, they essentially said that for the groups of organisms in front of us, look at their morphological characters and group them based on those characters, which essentially means that all organisms which are very close to each other in terms of characters, they will form one species. Another group which has observably different morphological characters, they will form another species. Now, the good thing about this definition is that it is easy. So, you can even look at museum specimens, and based on that you can figure out which belongs to one species and which specimen belongs to another species. It applies to sexual as well as asexual species, it even applies to fossil species. However, the primary problem with this definition is that there is a degree of arbitrariness to it. Okay. So, one taxonomist can say that this organism belongs to this species and that one belongs to that species. Another guy can come and say, oh no, we need to combine these to form a single species, but that organism, that one actually belongs to a different species, and so on. So, in other words, it becomes very subjective to the expertise of the taxonomist who is looking at the species. So, that is why people often prefer the other concept of species, which is the so called biological species concept, which says that species are groups of actually or potentially interbreeding natural populations which are reproductively isolated from other such groups, which basically means that if two groups of organisms are able to exchange genes with each other, they belong to the same species. If they cannot exchange genes, they are reproductively isolated, then they belong to two different species. So, as this shows you that this concept was given by Ernst Mayr in the 1940s, which, as we have already discussed, is around the time when the modern synthesis is getting crystallized. Now, obviously, this is a more objective definition of a species, but there are lots and lots of issues in terms of actualizing this definition. Why is that? Now, suppose you have two different species of birds or two different groups of birds, which are, let us say, looking a little bit different, and you think that they are belonging to two different species. Now, in order to prove that, what do you need to do? You need to actually try and make them breed, and you need to try a lot before you say that these guys are not breeding with each other, they are not exchanging genes, and therefore, I am going to say that they belong to two different species, right? Sounds great. The point is, who exactly has ever done it? Who has the time to take all possible groups and made them and try to breed them in all possible combinations? Nobody does, right? So, which is why, although theoretically this is very nice, in reality it is very difficult to show directly that these are not breeding. Sometimes you can say, okay, the geometry of the genitals are reproductive organs are such that they cannot possibly mate. You can make those kinds of arguments, but when you are talking about groups which are very close to each other in terms of their properties, even those arguments are not necessarily easy to make, right. The biological species concept have many other issues. So, for example, we are talking about exchange of genes. So, obviously, implicitly we are thinking about sexual organisms. What about asexuals which do not exchange genes ever? What about fossils? What about museum specimens? In those cases, even if you have the organism in front of you, you can never figure out whether they even potentially exchange genes or not, right. So, which is why although the biological species concept is something that most of you, when you were in school, you would have studied as the species concept, realistically speaking it is actually very difficult to use that concept to unambiguously differentiate organisms into different species, particularly when they resemble each other quite a bit. I mean, you can probably take a fish and a reptile and say that okay, these two belong to two different species, there is no way they are going to mate with each other, and you will probably be correct. But if you are talking about two different species of reptiles or two different species of closely related species, fishes, then it becomes much more difficult. Looking at species in these two particular ways also allows you to answer that famous statement that many people are often known to making in biology, which is that Darwin's origin of species does not really talk about origin of species. Okay, you might encounter this statement here and there, and the answer to this paradox is actually contained in this slide. So, when Darwin was talking about origin of species, he was thinking in terms of the morphospecies. He was thinking in terms of sufficient amount of change that is happening in a group of organisms, such that at some point they look very different from the ancestral form, and therefore, you call them two different species, the ancestral form and the evolved form. However, when you have that statement that Darwin's origin of species does not talk about origin of species, the second species is actually the biological species, where there is reproductive isolation. Now, Darwin, since he was not thinking in terms of reproductive isolation, therefore, he never really talked about any mechanism for the same, right. In fact, there is no mechanism that will automatically evolve or guaranteed to evolve due to natural selection. So, in modern synthesis, what we say is, or rather what evolutionary biologists think is that if you have changes accumulating over long time, then at some point they may lead to reproductive isolation. Okay. And as we are going to see in a few minutes, we have tons and tons of examples where such reproductive isolation can and does develop. But there is nothing in the theory which says that accumulated changes over long time will lead to reproductive isolation. It empirically happens, but there is no theory to say that this is definitely going to happen, which is why people try to portray these two definitions of species as something that is leading to an inconsistency in evolutionary biology, whereas it actually does not lead to any such thing. Okay. These are two just different ways of looking at the species concept, and as long as you are clear in your head about which species concept you are talking about, there will not be any paradox arising out of it. Anyway, so the other important concept is that of evolution. What is evolution? Now, many people have defined evolution in their own ways. I will take one such definition. This is a definition which is due to this famous evolutionary biologist called Jonathan Losses. It features in the Princeton Guide to Evolution, and it says that evolution is the transformation of species through time, including both changes that occur within species as well as the origin of new species. Okay. So, there are 3 or 4 terms in this definition which we should unpack. First, this is talking about transformation of species, right. So, which means that there is some kind of a change that will happen over time, and it is explicitly talking about the fact that this will happen at two different levels. One level is within species. Okay. So, this is the kind of stuff wherein let us say you are studying say height of a particular species, and over time across generations say the height has average height of the population has continuously increased or continuously decreased. So, that is what we mean by changes within a species. And when this thing happens for quite some time, according to the morphospecies concept, at some point you will end up getting a new group arising. Okay, this might be due to, as I said, accumulated changes in morphology, hence morphospecies, or it might even be due to reproductive isolation setting in which case it will be biological species, whatever, does not matter. But the change will be so large that at some point it will lead to the formation of something new. So, this first part where we are talking about change which is incremental change which is occurring within a group, this is what is known as microevolution, and the second part where we are talking about the origin of new groups, this is what is known as macroevolution. So, this distinction is something that one should keep in mind, and as we progress further we are going to talk a lot more about microevolution and macroevolution. Now, when it comes to this particular definition, there are a couple of points that one needs to remember. First point is that this is talking about change at the species level and not at the individual level. This is very important. Why? So, think about it. When let us say you were born, or when even I was born, we were about this size, right. However, today when you and I are sitting here and chatting with each other, we are much larger than that, somewhere between 5 feet, 6 feet, whatever are our heights. So, obviously, we went from this big to this big. Okay. However, that change is happening in us as individuals, right. That is not a change that is happening at the group level, and therefore, this change is not what evolution is, not what will be called as evolution. This is development. Okay. From this body size we have developed to this body size. So, evolution explicitly excludes this kind of a change. It only talks about changes that are happening at the group level, and therefore, related to the first point, evolution is explicitly about change that is happening across generation and not within generation. So, for example, suppose I take a bunch of babies about this size and I track them for say 10 years, 15 years, after which time they become larger. Okay. So, their average height has gone from say about 1 feet to say about 5 feet. That change in average height, although it is at the group level, it is still not going to be called evolution, because we are tracking the change within the same generation. In order for us to think about it as evolution, we have to look at the average height at the parental generation and compare that with the average height at the offspring generation or the grand offspring generation or the grand offspring generation and so on. Okay. In other words, the change has to be looked at across generation time scale and not a within generation time scale. This is very crucial. So, with these two definitions, now we are going into the primary question for this module, which is that why do we think that the process of evolution has happened in the past, and related to this, why do we think that it is still happening. Okay. So, before we start with the main question, we will have a quick recap of what we have heard about this question in the previous module. So, if you remember, in the previous module we have talked about two historical theories of species diversity. Now, let me make it clear over here that there can be many more, but these are the two that we talked about in module 1, and these two are what? Creationism versus, I will just call it Darwinism or the modern theory, whatever. So, according to these two theories, if we talk about origin of life, then creationism says that life originated as many times as there were species. In other words, each species was created de novo, okay, from the scratch by the god, the creator, or whatever, some divine being. Whereas evolutionary biology, the modern theory, says that life originated once or at max extremely few times. Okay. So, I will at some point I will explain, not in this lecture, but maybe in the next one, why this extremely few times comes, but most people think that it is just once, but if you are really logically rigorous about it, you will see that it is extremely few times. Okay. Now comes the question, where do we get all the diversity, the biodiversity around us, where does that come from? So, if you are thinking about creationism, then you do not really need a special explanation for this, because this says that the divine forces have created all the forms right at the beginning in their present avatar. However, if you look at evolutionary biology, it says that there was one or few ancestral species, and those species there has been descent with modification from them, which basically means they have produced babies and those babies have produced further babies, and when this descent has happened, in the process of this descent there have been slight changes, small changes, and these changes interacting with the environment due to selection and other forces etc., have led to the formation of species, many species over long time, and therefore, the entire biodiversity that we see around us is because of this descent with modification. Okay. And the third question is that if we look at all these species, do they have the capacity to change? And creationism says that no, that cannot happen, all species originated in their final form, whereas evolutionary biology says that yes, species can and they do change. Okay. So, if you think about it, there are multiple separate questions that we are dealing over here. First question, do species really change? I am going from bottom to top. Do species really change? Second question, can species arise from pre-existing species? And the third question, has descent with modification really occurred or not? So, these are the three questions that we are going to investigate in this module over this lecture and the next few discussions. So, let us tackle the first question, do species really change? And turns out that we actually have tons and tons of evidence, direct empirical observation to suggest that this indeed happens. So, I will show you one very famous example over here. So, this is the famous industrial melanism case on peppered moths, Biston betularia. So, these moths, they are found in many places in the world, but the study I am talking about is in the context of England, and this is what these moths used to look like. So, this is what is known as the forma typica, which means the typical form. So, you can see that these are light colored with some little black patches on them, but mostly light colored. Now, these guys in the pre-industrial revolution era, remember industrial revolution starts in England, right. So, in the pre-industrial revolution era, early 1800s, the dark forms were actually extremely rare, and it is these forms, the white forms, that are common. Now, somewhere once industrial revolution starts in the 19th century or actually late 18th century, what happens? Lots of factories are created. When you have factories, these factories have chimneys. From these chimneys, they are burning coal as the primary fossil fuel. So, that coal is leading to soot that is coming out of these chimneys, and that soot is going and getting deposited in buildings and trees and everything around them. So, as a result of industrial revolution, there was a lot of soot deposition, because of which the barks of the trees became very dark. Now, prior to this, these areas, the barks were primarily covered by lichens, okay, lichens, right. So, these are basically life forms which are like typically you find them on rocks or tree barks and so on. So, these lichens, they essentially looked pretty much like this wing of this Forma typica western betularia. Now, because of this, when in the pre-industrial era, when these typical forms they sat on these barks, they actually kind of blended with the barks, they got camouflaged, and birds and other predators could hardly see them. However, once the industrial revolution happened and the soot deposition happened on the barks became dark. And when the barks became dark, then in a dark background, this white form was actually extremely conspicuous and they became very much visible to the predators. When that happened, the predation rate on these forms increased and the darker forms, the so called Forma carbonaria, these were at a massive advantage. And because of this, within a few decades, by the late 1800s, the dark forms started dominating. Dominating in the sense that at certain places they shot up to 98 to 99% of all the forms, whereas in the pre-industrial era they were like 0.001 or even less percentage. So, by late 1800s, once the bark becomes dark, then these forms are at an advantage because now they blend very nicely with the dark bark and they cannot be seen by the birds. However, there is another twist in the story. Remember that people at some point understood that all the air pollution that is happening due to those chimneys, that is bad for health. Therefore, at some point in England, they pass all kinds of laws to reduce the amount of discharge from the chimneys, because of which the smoke becomes much cleaner and the soot that was deposited over time, that amount of soot actually starts going down. And when that happens, very interestingly, now the balance shifts in the other direction. So, once again the trees become whiter, the lichens come back. So, remember lichens cannot exist if you have high levels of air pollution. So, the moment air pollution reduces, lichens come back. When lichens come back, then again these typica forms they sit on those and they become, now these are harder to see, the typica forms are harder to see, whereas the carbonaria forms become much more easily observable to the predators, and because of that the number or the frequency of the carbonaria form starts declining steadily. Very interestingly, exactly the same thing plays out in North America, because remember at some point North America also becomes highly industrialized, and at some point again they also pass laws which reduce air pollution, and once that happens again the typica form comes back, the carbonaria form actually disappears. So, what this shows us, direct empirical evidence, is that species can and change their properties sometimes extremely fast. This is just one example. There are like millions of examples of this type in the literature. So, for example, evolution of antibiotic resistance in bacteria, evolution of DDT resistance in mosquitoes, and so on and so forth. I mean, there are tons and tons of such things. Therefore, another big example, okay, this what I am showing you is from natural environment. Another set of examples are from selective breeding. Remember, this is something that we humans have been doing for like millennia, right. So, if you remember, most of the crops and most of the vegetables that we eat today, most of them are actually products of selective breeding. And one massive example of this comes from in the form of different vegetables from wild mustard. So, we all know about broccoli, we know about cabbage, we know about cauliflower. So, there is this thing called kale, which is nowadays eaten in many parts of India too. But do you really know that all these forms are actually coming from the same form, which is the wild mustard plant Brassica oleracea, right. So, what has happened is that in different places, different people have selected these plants for different parts of the plant. So, for example, cabbage is basically a terminal leaf bud which has become very much expanded. Broccoli is again the flower buds, cauliflower is again the flower buds, kale is essentially just the leaves. And if you look at the genetics of these organisms, if you take their DNA and you sequence them, cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, all of them have exactly the same set of genes. They are the same species, but what is really happening over here is that in front of our own eyes, these things have essentially changed their forms greatly. The other big example of this is from dogs. So, we all know that dogs at some point were domesticated from wolf like organisms by humans, and then different breeders bred them for different purposes. And this is just one example of the tremendous amount of variation that you see in size. So, this is a Great Dane, the big one, the small one is a Chihuahua, both of them are dogs, both of them can even exchange genes, but look at the amount of change that is there between them. So, the basic point that I am trying to make over here is that it is totally proven beyond any doubt with tons of examples that species are not a constant entity, they can and they do change over time. Now, so one part of what Darwin was saying is obviously correct, species do change, but then the question is, does this change lead to the origin of new species or not? Remember, Darwin said yes, and obviously whether the answer to this question is yes or no depends on which definition of species you are talking about, right. So, if you are talking in terms of the morphospecies concept, then the previous examples that I gave you, these two, okay, obviously these are two different species of dogs over here, these are four different species of mustard or whatever vegetables over here, right. However, if you are thinking in terms of the biological species concept, because the dog and the Chihuahua and the Great Dane are exchanging genes, you will argue that no, then this is not a species. So, that brings us to the question that this thing is an example for new morphospecies, but not for biological species. So, does that mean that can new biological species arise from existing species? Okay. What do you think is the answer? The answer again is a resounding yes. So, again there are many examples, I will just share one with you. This is something that happened in the Kew Gardens. So, this is a very famous botanical garden in London, and note the year 1900. This is the year in which Mendel's theory is getting rediscovered by Hugo de Vries and Correns and others. Okay. So, what happened in the Kew Gardens was amazing. So, they had two different species called Primula floribunda and Primula verticillata. So, in this particular case Primula floribunda, they had 2n equal to 18 chromosomes, and the same for the other species. So, normally these are not supposed to interbreed, but they were actually able to interbreed, and they formed a F1 hybrid which consisted of 9 chromosomes from floribunda, 9 chromosomes from verticillata. Now, normally if you have a hybrid like this will be infertile, because when the hybrid is supposed to reproduce, then the homologous chromosomes will not be there, and therefore, it will not be able to do mitosis, and it will not be able to no meiosis, and it will not be able to create the reproductive cells. However, in this particular case something magic happened. What was the magic? The magic was that there was a chromosome doubling. In other words, it had 2n equal to 18, but all the chromosomes were doubled, because of which 2n became equal to 36, but now every chromosome had a homologous chromosome. And more importantly, due to the chromosome doubling, in one step you had the formation of a new species which is today known as Primula cubensis, okay, because of the fact that it happened in the Kew Gardens. So, as you can see, this looks still the flower color is yellow, but if you look at the flower structure closely, you will see that the flower structures are actually very different. And today this is an established breed, and you can actually find this even commercially, right. So, this is one example. Now, obviously, you are going to say, just one example, is that good enough? Obviously not. The point is that there are many such examples in many different species. I have just taken one random example simply because this is somewhat recent. So, what they did was they took Schizosaccharomyces pombe, which is a kind of yeast, and they were able to show that if you have certain genes are modified, then in one step you will get the formation of a new group, and this new group is going to be reproductively isolated, totally reproductively isolated from the previous group. Okay. So, the key message that I want to convey over here is that it does not really matter how you define species, whether morpho or biological species concept, it can be shown that one species, a new species, can always originate from a pre-existing species, right. So, two things are done. Do species change? Yes. Do species originate from pre-existing species? Yes. Okay. But does that mean the fact that new species can originate from previous species, does that mean that all the biodiversity that we see around us has arisen from by the same process? Think about it. This is a logical question. Okay. I know that new species can arise from pre-existing species, but from that can I infer that all the new species, all the species that I see around us, they have arisen by a similar thing, by a similar process? And if you think about it closely, the answer is no. Okay, there is a logical fallacy over here which is called as affirming the consequent, and if you end up making this particular assumption, then you are performing that logical fallacy. Now, what is that fallacy? So, let me just give you an example. Suppose I say that if I shoot myself in the head, then I will die. Okay, that is a reasonable thing to say. Now, suppose I tell you or somebody else tells you that I am dead. Does that necessarily mean that I have been shot in the head? Obviously no, right? Why? Because although shooting in the head will kill me, but I can die in many other ways, right? I can die of old age, I can die of shot to my heart, or so many other ways. Therefore, the fact that I am dead does not necessarily mean that I have been shot in the head. Similarly, the fact that new species can arise from pre-existing species does not automatically mean that that is the process by which everything in all the biodiversity around us has arisen. It is possible that they might have arisen, or at least some of them might have arisen through some different process, right. So, what you need is a separate set of evidences to prove that the descent with modification is responsible for the entire biodiversity around us, and that topic, the evidences for descent with modification, is what we are going to discuss next. Okay. See you. Bye.